My name is Phil Garbodin. I'm a graduate student in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. And I study housing policy and specifically the way that housing policy interacts with the lives of low-income families. Families receive a voucher face a number of challenges when looking to lease up in a particular neighborhood. Probably the one that stands out the most is that in states such as Maryland and the majority of states around the country, landlords aren't required to accept a housing voucher, which is called source of income discrimination. So an otherwise qualified family could be rejected just because they're paying with a housing voucher. So that limits the number of landlords, particularly the number of landlords in lower poverty neighborhoods that a family can lease up with. We also have an issue in terms of the context of family life in low-income communities interacting with the voucher program. Depending on the city and the jurisdiction, families get between 30 and 60 days to use their voucher. And when that's mixed with a series of complex life events surrounding the voucher receipt, that can often mean that they're trying to move sort of at the last minute in a hurry. And if they don't find a place in that time frame, they lose their voucher and then they lose their subsidy. So having that sort of time limit can result not necessarily in fewer lease-ups, but in lease-ups in less than ideal circumstances for families. Looking at the distribution of white and black voucher holders across the metropolitan area, it seems like empirically, white voucher holders are able to access lower poverty neighborhoods, and black and Hispanic voucher holders tend to be concentrated in higher poverty, racially segregated tracts. I can only really hypothesize as to why that might be. It could be discriminatory practices. It could be the neighborhoods the voucher holders were leasing up to begin with. It's actually sort of an ongoing research project for us. So one thing about cities like Baltimore and a lot of higher poverty cities across the country is that the voucher program is overburdened, way beyond the need, very much exceeds the capacity. So in Baltimore, for example, well over 10,000 families are on the Section 8 wait list. And what happens is if a wait list exists for long enough, and they haven't even allowed new families on the wait list in Baltimore since I think 2003. So when you have a wait list that long, what a lot of PHAs have done is to randomize who gets off that wait list. And what that means for the family is that you have no ability to predict when you might receive a housing subsidy. And so what you do is you get a letter or a phone call from the PHA saying you have 30 days to use this voucher, and vouchers are incredibly valuable. But that doesn't take into account your life circumstance at that moment. And so what we find is families needing to hustle in order to use that voucher and use that subsidy because they can't predict and plan for when they might receive it. Probably the most common way that Section 8 voucher holders find units to lease up in is through websites like GoSection8.com, which tailors specifically to voucher holders, or in some jurisdictions, the PHA itself will have a list either in hard copy or on a computer at their office. And those lists tend to, with some exceptions, those lists tend to be populated by landlords who are sort of proactively seeking out voucher tenants rather than the PHA sort of proactively going to seek out landlords who will accept the voucher. And what that means is a landlord who has a property in an area where the market tenant, a tenant without a Section 8 voucher, could only afford, say, $500 a month, which is pretty understandable for, if you're only making $15,000 a year. They're less likely to want to market to those tenants because they can't afford to pay what the landlord wants for the apartment. Whereas someone with a Section 8 voucher is able to command, say, $1,100 for a similar unit. And therefore, what we see is that the landlords who are proactively marketing to voucher holders are doing so because of their economic interest, but what that means is that their properties tend to be in higher poverty neighborhoods. And I should always like to clarify there that the unit may or may not be worth, there's a lot of debate right now in the literature about whether the Section 8 sort of inflates the rent. And that may or may not be true. There's some very good papers out there about that, but this is sort of a more can you find any tenant to afford, even if it's a wonderful unit that is totally worth $1,100 a month, the landlord still might not be able to find anyone who's willing to live in a particular neighborhood who is able to pay that amount. And so regardless of sort of some objective value of the unit, this strategy is still prevalent. So a family with a voucher is able to theoretically lease any unit in, well, any unit technically in the whole metropolitan region, although more likely just within the city or county that they live. But to avoid sort of luxury units, I suppose, HUD caps the amount that they're able to spend at somewhere between 40 and 50% of the area rent, so the 40th or 50th percentile metropolitan rent, to say it very technically. But what this means in effect is that at a metropolitan level, about half of the units will be too expensive for a voucher holder to lease up in. And because in most parts of the country, this limit is set more or less at the metro level, so to include both the center cities but also all the surrounding counties, it will be disproportionately limit access to neighborhoods that have higher rents and allow a greater supply of voucher-eligible units in higher poverty neighborhoods. So some places like Dallas, Texas, and I guess it's going to be 5 other sites they just approved, have switched from this sort of metropolitan-wide fair market rent to a smaller, they call small market rent. So instead of taking, say, the median rent for the whole metro region, they do the median rent in each zip code. And what that means is in a high poverty neighborhood, if the median rent for non-subsidized units is something like, say, $600 a month, that'll be the cap that a voucher will subsidize. Whereas in a a lower poverty zip code, the median rent will necessarily be higher. And the idea behind this is to remove the barrier, the fair market rent barrier, to moving to lower poverty neighborhoods. So a family would be able to lease up in any suburban community because about half the units there would be eligible, even if the rents overall in those suburban communities were much higher than in the central city. So when a voucher holder receives a voucher, they have about between 30 and 60 days to find a place to rent. And what that means is, if there's any sort of time pressure, it's much easier to rent a unit, say, next door to yours that you saw a sign or that your mother-in-law told you about within the neighborhood. What's much harder, much more time-consuming and expensive is to go out to a lower poverty neighborhood and search for housing there. And that's expensive from a time perspective. It's expensive from just putting in applications for units you might not get because application fees can be not insubstantial in suburban communities. And probably the biggest risk is that if you're doing that and if you're unable to find a unit that will accept you as a tenant, is rented below FMR, and takes vouchers, then you run out of time and you're forced to forfeit your voucher. And so when families do experience a time crunch, that can be a barrier to neighborhood upward mobility because it means they take the unit that's at hand rather than being able to invest the time to search in lower poverty neighborhoods. The housing quality standards, which is HUD's inspection process for voucher tenants, is sort of a double-edged sword, I guess, in some ways. It certainly does a lot of good in terms of ensuring that voucher holders and their families are living in largely lead-free units of decent quality. But it can also result in a lot of what we term as reactive mobility. Because if you have a landlord who isn't able to keep his property up to these requirements, the HUD inspections will basically force you to move to a higher quality unit. But that's not necessarily a move that you're in a position to make. I mean, I think one of the ways to think about it, even sort of from any standards, is that upgrading your housing to something that's, you know, of acceptable quality is always a good thing. But if you're not able to choose the timing of that move, it's not hard to see how it can be disruptive. The biggest barrier to mobility moves to lower poverty neighborhoods, is the complexity of what is called the portability process. So vouchers tend to be administered not at the metro level, but by local jurisdictions. So in Baltimore, Baltimore City distributes vouchers, Baltimore County has a separate agency, and then the surrounding counties of Harford and Carroll, whatever, all have their own agencies. And while it is technically possible and is not, and it is occasionally used to take a voucher issued in Baltimore City, say, and move out to a low-poverty suburb like Howard County without any subsidy laws. The fact that they're administered by different agencies results in significant complexity both for the voucher holder and for the public, the PHAs that are administering the voucher. And so whenever anything's difficult on both sides, it tends to happen a lot less frequently. So there's been steps made to streamline that process. I think the more that can be done in terms of administering voucher programs at a metro level, the fewer administrative barriers there will be to opportunity moves, mobility moves. Along with that, searching in suburban neighborhoods can be time-consuming and it can be expensive, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with low-poverty neighborhoods. You don't know what neighborhoods are good, which are bad, which are connected to public transportation, all of that. So providing families with mobility housing counseling, which is more than providing them with a list of units, but actually taking the time to talk through the costs and benefits of particular units in suburban areas, talk about what it would change in terms of school quality, talk about what transportation options are there, and be realistic in terms of what those transportation limits would be. The more you're able to promote housing mobility with the voucher program. So for families who want to move to lower poverty neighborhoods with their voucher, mobility programs like the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program can make a huge difference in making that possible. By matching families with counselors who are familiar with what's available in suburban neighborhoods and are able to promote the benefits of a suburban move, families are much more able to lease up. And even little things like being more lenient, let's say, on lease-up times. I know the mobility programs tend to have longer than 60 days, just to make sure that families find what they're looking for and are ready to move when it's time to move. One of the main barriers to moving to lower poverty neighborhoods is that landlords don't have to accept a housing choice voucher if they don't want to. And this is true of most states and municipalities across the country, with some exceptions. And so changing the law so that you can no longer discriminate based on source of income, based on what the family is using to pay for the housing with, is an important first step in that. But it really goes beyond that in a lot of ways. Even if a landlord doesn't need to discriminate on a voucher, in suburban neighborhoods, they may have multiple applications for a single unit and tighter housing markets. And so they have totally legitimate reasons to select non-voucher tenants if, say, their alternative applicants have better credit and better rental histories. And so one of the key things about mobility programs is investing the time, energy, and staff into marketing the program to landlords, promoting the benefits of accepting a tenant with a mobility voucher or a Section 8 voucher in terms of, you get your rent on time, automatically deposited, you don't have to chase tenants. For just one example, is a huge part of what makes a successful mobility program. So one of the things we find is that when families look for housing in suburban neighborhoods, they're fully aware that landlords don't need to accept a housing voucher, and so they choose information sources that contain only landlords marketing to voucher holders, such as GoSection8.com. And this further limits their options in the market because they're only looking for at the subset of landlords for whom it's, economically feasible or not economically profitable to rent to a voucher holder. And so families avoid dealing with situations where they might be turned down for a unit because they have a voucher. And so because sort of in a normal Section 8 situation, families are avoiding marketing the program to landlords who might be on the fence That's why it's so important to have a partner like a housing counselor, like a realtor, someone like that who is able to talk to landlords on your behalf and sort of make the pitch about the benefits of renting to voucher tenants.